Without further ado, I just wanted to let everyone here at State Office introduce themselves, and then also our panelists who are on the line to also please take a moment and introduce yourself.
Good morning, my name is Liesl Ramos, and I am a program administrator in the operations section of ADT, and responsible for eligibility determinations, waiver enrollment, supported living, supported employment.
Ken Carroll, State Office, Transportation.
I'm John Bennett from the Office of Performance and Accountability here at APD.
Good morning, my name is Kalima Mohammed, and I coordinate the CMS compliance monitoring team.
Good morning, my name is David Darm. I am, I guess, the co-facilitator of this webinar. I oversee our employment, adult day training, and transportation programs here at State Office.
Good morning, this is Lindsay Riley with State Office, and I am in employment with David Darm.
So, anything else, Elizabeth? Thank you. That was a great job getting everything introduced. Good. Okay. Well, I want to now move to the panelists to have an opportunity for them to introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, what organization you represent, and what area or that you serve as far as a region of the state.
Good morning, I'm Pauline Lips, and I am a member of the Family Care Council and a parent of a 46-year-old male who has been working part-time in a restaurant as a dishwasher.
Thank you, Pauline.
If you are a panelist and you are trying to unmute yourself, just take a moment, look at the little microphone icon next to your name, click it. When it turns green, you'll be unmuted.
Good morning, this is Jan Pierce from the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. I work statewide primarily on programs such as supported employment, discovery, customized employment. I'm also a grandparent of a 14-year-old young man with various disabilities, so have a great interest in our conversation today.
Thank you, Jan.
Jean Malaco, I'm representing Family Care Council 9, which is Palm Beach County. I have a 30-year-old daughter who is part-time working, did not enjoy the ADT at all, loves work.
Thank you, Jean.
Hi, this is Kirk Hall, CEO of the ARC of Florida. We represent 31 chapters throughout Florida who are involved both with ADT and all kinds of varieties of employment.
Thank you, Kirk.
This is Courtney Swilley. I'm participating on behalf of Suzanne Sewell with the Florida Association of Rehabilitation Facilities. We represent over 60 members across the state that provide ADT and employment services.
Thank you, Courtney.
Good morning, this is Missy Rogers. I'm with the ARC Gateway in Pensacola, which is in the Northwest region. We are a provider agency providing both ADT and supported employment.
Thank you, Missy. You might want to move a little bit further away from your speaking. It's kind of was kind of muffled.
You got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Carrie Bates. I am from the Northeast region, ARC of Putnam County. We serve approximately 120 adults.
I'm sorry, we can't hear your muffled.
Carrie, can you either get closer to your mic or turn your mic volume up, please?
I can try. Is that better?
It's a little better.
Okay. Northeast Region, ARC of Putnam County, and I'll work on my mic in the meantime.
Thank you, Carrie.
Let's see if she's not on.
Hold on one second, folks. We have one work group member who's trying to get on and is having some trouble. Who else, Kalima, who else do we?
We have Michelle Tolini, who's having difficulty unmuting from her phone. And she's a CEO for Adult Care Housing. They have 6 behavior-focused group homes. Previously, she was the director for a large ADT with over 175 members.
Okay.
Is-
Panelists. Oh, let's see. I'm trying to think of who else we have.
Caitlin, has Caitlin?
This is Rachel over at Disability Rights Florida.
Good morning.
And we cover the whole state of Florida, and we're Florida's protection advocacy group. So we're very excited to be here today.
Thank you, Rachel. Caitlin, can you hear us?
Okay. Caitlin, your line's muted. What about Denise Pilgrim?
Oh, yes.
Denise, would you like to introduce yourself? Okay, can you slide down, please? Michelle?
Okay. Got all?
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you all for the members of the public and interested parties who called in and participating. Kalima and I are going to co-facilitate this discussion. I'm going to give a little bit of a background for those. There are some of you who were not able to make it on the May 23rd forum that we held. This is a follow-up to that discussion. So I'm going to give a little bit of a summary, and then I'm going to turn it to Kalima to kind of lay out the objectives of this particular work group. And for those of you who are participating, listening in, these questions are also posed to you as we go into this discussion. To please provide us your feedback either through the chat feature or to email me. You should have my email address. If not, I'll give it to you at the end. That we'll be able to collect all the feedback. So with that, first of all, for those of you who don't know me, I have been involved in this project with the agency for 2 years, but I've had a background in focusing particularly on employment initiatives for people with disabilities. I myself am visually impaired, so this is a personal passion of mine of helping individuals with various disabilities overcome barriers to their independence. This initiative came about in large part because we have a lot of federal and state initiatives to try to increase opportunities for people with developmental disabilities to go to work and be successful in competitive employment. But also there's the community integration aspect of our day programs, looking at folks who need to be able to get out in the community and be a part of other meaningful day activities, and how that also supports somebody who is wanting to work. There is a larger aspect to this than just employment. So we started this discussion on last month, on May 23rd, to begin engaging our stakeholders, and these are provider organizations, self-advocates, and families, but how we can begin to move and change the system in a way that's going to increase those opportunities while also being cognizant of the other aspects of these programs that support wraparound an individual's wellness, quality of life, health and safety, and then looking at ways we can go into the future, how do we monitor the success of these changes? So we are working with two national consultants through our CMS compliance review to help us start this conversation. Reed Kennedy-Lazat and Mary Stowers came down last month to our Tallahassee office and facilitated the discussion, because this isn't just a Florida issue, this is a national issue that a lot of states are figuring out ways they can redesign their home and community-based waiver programs to increase employment and increase community integration. So they brought their expertise to help us begin this conversation, but the idea is that this isn't going to be a one and done. We're not here to simply just come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. This is designed to really help us be engaged in an ongoing discussion with our stakeholders about ways we can improve this system. I'd like to start with a quote before we get into the objectives. The quote that we used in our employment initiative that I think is fitting for this discussion is from a great sage prophet named Yoda. If any of you are fans of Star Wars, there is a quote from Yoda that says, I will spare you from my impersonation of him and his voice. If no mistake have you made, yet losing you are, different game you should play. And I think that with that's important as we go into the discussion, that we recognize that there is a significant systematic barrier that a lot of people with disabilities face to trying to get to work and being independent and being able to do the things that all of us can enjoy doing. At the same time, and somebody made a comment in our forum last month that I think resonated with this, which resonates with what we're trying to do, which is we have to be willing to take risks. We have to be willing to sometimes fail, because the alternative right now is by staying with the way it is, we will still have this problem. It's not going to just fix itself. And it's not going to just take the agency to be able to do this. It's going to take a collaborative effort. So we've invited you as work group members representing pieces of this puzzle. And we're hoping that each of you can bring a perspective to help the collective group find ways to solve this problem. I'm going to share some of the highlighted challenges to kind of get us in the, from what we discussed on the 23rd of May. But when I turn it to Kalima, we're going to need to move beyond just focusing on the problem, but actually starting to get into the solution side of it. So I'm going to share with you some of the major highlights that came out of the discussion last month. One is we recognize, and a big part of the discussion was understanding the national and state policies that are pushing this effort towards systems change. So we have to be cognizant as we go into looking at ways to change adult day training or reforming that and supported employment services, that it fits in with the vision that was set by the Home and Community-Based Settings Rule, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, the state's Employment First Initiative. All these efforts need to be considered as a part of the discussion. Another aspect, and this is a big one that is part of this work group, is how do we facilitate long-term collaboration within the system to support individuals throughout their life journey. This is not just employment. This is looking at it from the educational system. As individuals are going through the school system, what are their needs? As they're getting ready to graduate, what are their needs? As they're adults, what are their needs? What do Voc Rehab provide, and what does APD provide that complement each other? And how do these systems work together to making sure the information that individuals are receiving are consistent? And then understanding, of course, the meaningful day aspect of it. So as somebody's going to work, it's not simply that they just go to work, but what does our system do to support their other aspects of their life? Another big issue that came out was identifying employment as a goal on our person-centered plan. And again, how do the meaningful day activities surround that goal? This is a significant challenge, particularly in our system at APD. We have heard, this isn't news to most people on this call, that oftentimes people go through voc rehab, the school system, and APD with having multiple different goals and different plans, and they don't always connect. How do we be able to maybe move towards making that system more connected to supporting individuals' employment? Addressing funding barriers is definitely something that came up out of last month's discussion, and we recognize wholeheartedly that the funding is definitely a part of this discussion and that there are limitations to the way we can be able to support individuals in a long-term employment. We want to be addressing those issues. We also want to be cognizant of our, on the same side of balancing it with cost effectiveness. As Kennedy Lazat mentioned, there are states that have tried to address the funding issue by investing a lot more money in employment services, but yet their outcomes were not necessarily reaching that same goal. So even though we want to be able to consider those ways that we can maybe address those issues, we need to also be aware that it's ultimately trying to address increasing employment outcomes for people with disabilities and not simply just changing the funding structure. Couple more things, and then I'll turn it to Kalima that came out of last month's discussion. Perceptions and expectations. This isn't simply just a policy change that we're looking at. We're looking at a culture change.
That's what I see. There's nothing. Oh, there's this stuff now. More stuff. Because most people use.
Yeah. So the culture change that we're looking at is within the employer community. How do employers be able to know how to hire, make accommodations for people with disabilities, but also looking at what's the culture change within our system and amongst the families that we're impacting, the school system, when individuals are going through how is work discussed and being a part of their discussion as they're thinking about their futures. And then one more point that came out, the highlight of the discussion from last month, I think worth mentioning is we're talking about a lot about skills training, life skills training, and that is across the board, not just employment. But when we specifically are looking at employment, what kind of skills training do we need to be considering and preparing individuals to actually compete in the workforce? There was several ideas mentioned about looking at partnerships with post-secondary education programs. Some of our ADTs are doing a phenomenal job at building those relationships to support individuals with specific skills training that they can use in a workplace. So these are some considerations. And then I failed to mention that we did have a PowerPoint we were working on and just didn't get it done in time for this meeting. But that the presentation we're going to have is a summary of today's discussion. We'll have that available along with when we provide the summary of the feedback we received. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Kalima to kind of get into the objectives of the work group, and then we'll have a discussion on that, and then we'll go into the meat and potatoes of this discussion.
Good morning. We have 3 objectives for today's meeting, and one of the big things that we've noted with all of the research that we've done on redesigns for waiver services is the services and the redesign tends to be more successful when states work with stakeholders to ensure that everybody's needs are being addressed in the redesign. And so that's the reason that we are working with you guys. And the objectives for the work group is we want to work with you to ensure that we get the necessary assistance in developing strategies to support more individuals with developmental disabilities in competitive integrated employment. We want to identify challenges and opportunities within the iBudget waiver for individuals to participate in employment and community activities. And we had a question from Todd Ryan asking, are handbook changes on the table to ensure success? There are a lot of things that we are not going to take off the table, and that's going to be based on our discussions today and future discussions, because we know that things have to change. We just aren't sure what they are. So everything is on the table. And the third objective is to propose changes to the iBudget funded supported employment and adult day training services to address the above objectives. So we are working with you to ensure that we meet those objectives. And if there are any other things that you think we should be working on to meet these objectives, this is the opportunity for us to get that feedback over the next hour or so. So with that, we're going to now look at the areas of focus for the redesign.
Before we go to the areas of focus, is there any thoughts from the work group members, just of what they would like to see in addition? And then we'll get into more of the issues, but just what do you want to see? What would you like to see from this work group? And how we go about tackling these problems, these challenges. Just wait.
Hi, this is Kurt. I know that we have some broad language here talking about how to address the changes. I'd like to see some of those things that we know to be our true barriers identified as part of this process, and then some plans made and how that's going to be addressed. I know that that's covered here in the agenda, so that's my hope for this panel and this work group, that as we are identifying the actual challenges, the actual barriers, that we're figuring out ways to make those manageable within the system so that we can actually achieve these things that we've laid out here before us.
Thank you, Kurt.
Okay. Anyone else before we go into the fun part?
Yes, this is Rachel over at Disability Rights Florida. My suggestion would be to maybe try to open up, as far as panelists, to get some additional self-advocates so we can really get good feedback on barriers that they're facing.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that, Rachel. We want to work on that as well. We have a couple. One of them couldn't make it to today's meeting, but absolutely need to make sure that they're a part of the discussion. And we want to specifically look at self-advocates that are impacted both by ADT and employment, because both of those are a part of the discussion. So we want to be cognizant that there are multiple needs that we're trying to address here, not just one pieces of it. Okay, last call before we go into the services.
There's one comment that Kari Anderson made to suggest that we work with Department of Education to try and strengthen this redesign. So, and that's something that came out in the meeting of May 23rd. Mm-hmm. So that's something that we are looking into.
Absolutely.
So thanks, Kari.
Yes, thank you. This is great. All right, I'm excited because I can't wait to hear what the feedback I'm going to get on these questions. So, Elizabeth, can you pull up the agenda for them to be able to follow?
It's already up.
It's up. Okay. So if you can look at your agenda, we've got on the item 3, areas of focus for a redesign. I kind of want to walk through. This is a broad start to this discussion. I'm going to give a little summary of each of these services, and then we're going to get into a discussion about how to address these. So probably for the sake of time, I'll go through all 3 real quickly and then get in. That way we can just have it from this point on, we can get into the questions so we cover all the areas. First off, one area of focus that we're interested in is the individual supported employment service. This service is, now we're talking about supported employment that's funded through the iBudget waiver. We know that most often supported employment is provided in 2 phases. Voc Rehab generally provides the first phase of job development, training, skills building, to help an individual get what they need to be prepared for a job. That can include a myriad of services, not just simply getting a job, but also VR provides a lot of discovery and other kinds of services to help somebody explore what employment is as a part of a goal and the long-term goal for their future. And then the waiver generally provides the phase 2, which is really going to be a lot of the focus of this particular discussion for redesign, which is ongoing long-term supports when an individual is in competitive integrated employment. About the last 3 years, we've had about 1,700 individuals receive individual supported employment services through the iBudget waiver. That number has been pretty much the same. We recognize that this program has had challenges with the way it's delivered, and we want to hear those issues brought up today. But one of the big ones that we want to really hone in on is the idea is that each individual is different. This is hence why it's called an individual service. And so how do we ensure, one of the questions I want to pose to the work group is, how do we ensure that these supports are adequately meeting the individual's needs? Some individuals need more support, some need less. How do we recognize that in our system? Ensuring that people who actually need the additional supports are getting it. And on the same time, as I mentioned at the beginning, also we have to balance, how do we make this service continue to be cost effective? Nationally, the service expectation is that there is a fading component to the service, which is as an individual is becoming successful on the job, that the job coach will fade over time, not necessarily fade completely, because we all experience changes in our jobs at some point or another, and having that recognition that still may need to be there, but also knowing when it's time for that individual to be able to do a lot more of those work tasks independent without the job coach present. Second, group supported employment. This is a service that we're interested in exploring, understanding what that expectation is. According to the federal expectation from CMS, this is usually a service provided in a small group setting, usually entailing work skills like enclave and mobile crew activities. They have to pay at competitive wages, but they're not necessarily integrated in the community. So this has been an interesting area of focus for us this year, because we noticed that the last few years when we've looked at the data, this service is not relatively, it is very, very underutilized. It is, we've had less than 50 participants involved in this program. And there might be a myriad of reasons to that, including possibly the way that the rate structure is set up and the service expectations are set up, but we would be interested to hear your thoughts as to why that is, and what is the expectation of this service? Is this service being able to support what the expectations are at the federal level and national level in terms of helping an individual learn skills that could be maybe eventually move towards a progressive approach towards competitive integrated employment in the future? And then if you turn to the next page on your agenda, adult day training. Now this service, we have it designed currently under the current structure. It is a catch-all of work and non-work meaningful day activities. So many of our ADTs are providing skills specific towards work related, and some of them are doing more of the social, recreational types of life skills training that need to be a part of that meaningful day. So we want to be able to consider all those components, but we structured these questions really to kind of address both. The first 2 questions on your outline here are kind of more tackling the life skills non-work. So how are the individual's interests, strengths, barriers being considered in the planning of these activities? You know, we love to use the term person-centered plan, that it's an individualized approach And yet these services tend to be provided in group settings, and the 1 to 6 to 1 to 10 is generally the approach. How are those, understanding that those services are designed a certain way to be served in a group, but how are the individual's interests being considered as a part of that process? Another issue that we want to explore is what kinds of activities are occurring, these ADT activities are occurring out in the community, or as we have in our structure right now called ADT offsite. What do these activities entail? Are they work and non-work, or just simply enclave and mobile group? And if so, how are those different from group-supported employment? And then also, how are these providers who are doing these offsite activities, how are they implementing it? This is something that is a very big interest nationally, to seeing how best practices of certain providers are doing the community-based approach to this service. We recognize that there's a lot of challenges that come into that because the facility-based model is delivered in a certain way that's not necessarily feasible in a community-based way. So how do we understand how those providers currently are doing it, so that we don't take away from that, but also how do we encourage other providers to do that? And then finally, the work-based aspect. How are ADT providers identifying and supporting individuals who want to pursue competitive employment as a goal? This came up in the discussion last month. I believe one ADT said they were not necessarily aware of individuals actually who have employment goals on their service plan. So there might be a disconnect between what our case management system is doing with what the ADT providers are doing in this regard. So what are some ways that we can help support that, be a part of the discussion with the ADT service plan? And then finally, this was a huge area of focus from the last month, was work-based experiences. We've heard lots of positive results come out of work-based learning experiences. This is where VR particularly has invested a lot of money in the school system and the youth to do work-based learning experiences because it increases individuals' chances of success in employment. Where are some ways that ADTs can be able to be a part of that as part of their training, meaningful day activities? So I listed some of these questions, but I wanted to help us get in that framework of discussion. Now comes the fun part where I'm going to stop talking and let you all kind of weigh in. And even though we have work group members, of course, members of the public who are listening in, please provide us your feedback to these questions, some of the insights that we can learn as we go into looking at changes to these programs and improvements to these programs. So, Kalima, anything I need to add before we go in? Or?
No, I think you did a good job, and we're ready for the discussion.
Okay. You want to open it up?
Yep, okay, so I am going to unmute our 13 panelists. And if you are on that panelist list, please, once I unmute you, you will then have control over your own mic. So please just, be courteous and mute yourself when you are not talking. And for our attendees, feel free to continue to put your messages in our question box, and we will try to address some of those as they come in.
Hi, this is Kirk Hall with the ARC of Florida. One of the biggest barriers to increasing access to supported employment is transportation. Currently, transportation isn't supported very well for employment. Our individuals need to be able to go directly to a work site from home, be able to travel from that work site when those activities are finished back to home. And it's just not handled very well within the current system. And I know that our individuals who are here on the panel who are providing the services can give you some more detailed information about that. But transportation is probably that biggest barrier in making sure people are making that transition to employment, and that initial support to be able to access those work experiences, those employment services are critical for the person to make that transition.
Very good point.
If I might add, this is Kent Carroll One of the, I guess, the shortfalls of APD transportation is that the waiver will only pay for transportation to employment if you are receiving supported employment as a waiver service. And folks who are employed and are not receiving supported employment, they have to get transportation on their own outside of the waiver. I don't know if that's something that it's a part of this discussion, but in my view, that is something that we really need to address as far as making transportation available to folks who are not receiving supported employment and still need to go to work. I don't know how many of those individuals are out there fall into that category, but if we're really going to help people be self-employed, gainfully employed, I think we need to provide transportation in as many of those opportunities as possible.
So I have a question for the panelists to just sort of refocus us. I want to go back to the individual supported employment. And Kirk and Kent, those are really good points. And transportation, normally that's one of the barriers that come up for a lot of different things. So hopefully we can find a solution to this barrier, and it's within the waiver itself. So, but as it relates to the individual supported employment, how can we ensure that each individual receives adequate ongoing support to succeed in competitive integrated employment? And one of the things for the people who are not panelists, I want to let everybody know that we selected the panelists so that we can get a diverse group of providers, advocates, and self-advocates to help us with this redesign. And although they're the ones who are able to talk, we are taking the comments that are coming in, and we will use that in helping with the redesign. So we are wanting everybody, who don't have the ability to be vocal on the call to give your input also, please.
Good morning, this is Pauline Lips. I also think that we should consider somewhere, especially when we're working on any of these strengths or barriers, that it is so important to include for the individual someone who may be willing to provide some natural supports. Once an individual has a job and is successful, and the supported employment coach is is not showing up, at the job every day, every minute, there needs to be a person that can communicate with the employer as a natural support for that individual.
I think that was an agreement. That's a really that addresses the cost-effective aspect of the service, I think, too. That the natural support is like the identifying that is to help the job coach fade over time, but also supporting an individual to succeed on the job, so that they have those in place, so they're not solely relying on the job coach to being able to do those tasks. That's a very good point.
This is Jan Pierce. I just wanted to totally agree with that comment and indicate that as we place people in supported employment, before even that job site is developed and a job accepted, that we should be thinking about from the very beginning of someone's interest in employment about those natural supports. And certainly as we find a job, I mean, we don't want to wait till the job coach is starting to fade away. We want that to be a very important part of the job coach's duties and responsibilities, is to help locate those natural supports within that environment, all the strategies and techniques and supports that can be built in that are not dependent on the job coach. I mean, the far more likelihood of success for the individual. So that is something I know in our training in Voc Rehab that we're focusing on with providers, is really looking at natural supports from very, very beginning. And we intend to put a lot more focus on that going forward, because we do see that as a huge key to the long-term success.
There was a comment from Rebecca regarding ensuring that supported employment coaches are seeing and overseeing the person at the work site 95% of the time, versus to ensure evaluation of job tasks and abilities. And one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is, by the time a person gets to phase 2 of supported employment, we're expecting that they are they've been stabilized. And so for supported employment coaches to be on the job site 95% of the time, that's really something that you wouldn't expect to see in someone who has shown that they are stabilized in their work.
Hi, this is Rebecca. Let me add to that. I meant that they wouldn't be with the individual supervising and overseeing 95% of the time, but that when the job coach meets with the individual, that would be at the work site. Many times we see the employment coaches meeting with the individuals after work, at other locations, whereas the role of the job coach being at the work site, evaluating and monitoring the skill set of the individual, making sure that there aren't additional tasks that the individual needs to learn in order to be successful at the job.
Okay, that was really helpful to know.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't know I could unmute at that point. My apologies.
And I like Kevin Lewis's comment about unexpected lessons, because oftentimes, especially in this redesign plan, is we can come up with things that we think are superb or awesome, but oftentimes when we do that, especially when we do that without stakeholders, there are a lot of unexpected negative lessons. So that's why we have you guys at the table helping us with this redesign right now. And he gave, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has information that may be helpful. There's a model for substance use issues that shows a lot of these elements of redesigns. So I like the idea of ensuring natural supports, looking at unexpected, possible unexpected lessons, both positive and negative, and ensuring that individuals, when they're receiving that supported employment coaching, that is actually on site at work and not after work or anything like that, because then the supported employment coach could actually see things and identify opportunities for improvement. So I'd like to talk about what mechanisms need to be in place for the service to remain cost effective while meeting the unique needs of the individual. And that sort of, we recognize that money is one of the challenges that came up over and over in our May focus group. And we know that in the back of most providers' minds, that is one of their biggest challenges. So with that in mind, we need to ensure that whatever it is that we propose is cost effective. So how do we ensure that the change we develop is cost effective, but at the same time is able to meet the needs of individuals? Because a lot of the individuals may be individuals who are in ADTs and want to transition to employment, not the younger people who've had all this training in school and that kind of thing. So how do we ensure that? And if there are providers or panelists who have had some experiences and some best practice examples of how you have been able to do that, this would be a great opportunity to share that.
Hi, this is Kirk. I understand completely the need to make sure that things are cost effective. But when you're looking at this from a holistic point, the cost effective part of the service delivery is going to be realized when people are transitioning to that competitive integrated employment. So you're going to, by the nature of the beast, have to provide some additional support service initially so that people can make that transition, so that you can realize those cost savings where people are engaged in the work activities versus other activities, such as the securing of employment or going back into some of the hours that would have been spent otherwise in adult day training. It's that realization of that freeing up of those dollars that you're going to see the cost effectiveness come into play for this kind of process. So in looking at what you're going to do, you really want to invest in those things that help the individuals get the support they need and make the transition to competitive integrated employment to the extent that they can. And then you'll really need to take a hard look at then how the people are transitioning out and what that's doing to their overall dollars, and then saying what can we then do to this or with this to provide the other services and supports that we know are lacking. And that's kind of the thinking that we need to have in moving forward, is that I know that providers by and large right now, they're operating on a shoestring budget, if you will, to be able to even deliver services. And so certain things that are barriers, that put an additional cost or create a disincentive, those are the really the things that we need to look at adjusting or addressing to make it more manageable for the providers and for the individuals who want to pursue employment, so that they're not being disincentivized to make that next step towards employment.
Thanks,
Good morning. I'm Ron Sharp, the director at the Arc of the Bay. To add to what Kirk just said, VR is pretty much the cash cow. The perception from APD from a funding source is just challenging. And so naturally first of all, our number one goal is focusing on the clients, taking care of our customer. But we also have to have the funding to be able to operate. And VR has been that provider lately. Looking at some of the questions, one of the things that we've been doing over the last couple of years is really doing our best to embrace the dream-inspired planning process, where we're, it's just going through the discovery, but trying to get more integrated and out in the community more than we ever have. trying to do more things, think out of the box. We just were very, very fortunate to get a grant to do a certified coronary training program here. So I mean, we're perception is reality, if you will, and the perception is that VR is being able to help us meet the numbers that we have to meet to survive. We're in a small agency or having to fundraise. Kurt brought up earlier about transportation, and of course that's the biggest obstacle that we face. But thinking out of the box and still through all this whole process is just being centered like we should be on our clients. But for what that information is worth.
Thank you, Ron.
And thanks, Ron. That was great. You and Kirk had really good ideas, and we've received a lot of feedback from other people that I'd like to touch bases on. One of the comments is that we have to look at other resources, not just rely on what VR has to offer, because sometimes that's a process to access VR services. And so what we're trying to do here is figure out how do we work with our partners like VR, but meet the needs of the individuals. And there are comments regarding individuals who may not want to work, who may want a combination of support employment and ADT. And so by no means is this redesign being developed in a way that we're going to move everybody in ADT into employment. And even if they have a goal of employment, we recognize that individuals who have not worked, who have been in ADTs for a long time, are going to have soft skill needs so that they can be successful when they're on a job. I mean, they may have the actual skill set to do the job, but some of those soft skill needs are the things that they could be getting assistance with while they're in ADTs, so that once they get to a point where they're ready to work, they know how to do things like how to introduce themselves and how to, manage themselves in a work setting. So by no means is this an all or nothing. It's about meeting the needs of those individuals who want to work, and given the barriers of having a developmental disability that poses, trying to overcome that. And I know there are a lot of providers. There's a lot of typing about some best practices. So we'd like to hear from some of you panelists who, I mean, we all know that there are challenges, and finances may be one of the biggest challenges, but there are a lot of providers in this state who have overcome that, not fully, but there are providers who are providing examples of best practice services where people are able to go out and work. So we'd like to hear from some of you how you're doing that.
I'm not sure if I'm muted or unmuted. Does anyone hear me?
We hear you.
Oh, good. My name is Susan Goldstein. I'm the parent of an adult daughter with developmental disabilities and have been advocating for many, many years, actually 24 to be exact. And I've been working with several providers who offer different levels of skills training, which I think is very important as my daughter is pretty severely afflicted. We've been able to secure special appropriations, and some of it is through VR, but through the Adults with Disabilities Fund. And the goal of the services is to help individuals obtain and maintain employment, but they need to be trained first. And not all children or students or adults have the same level of cognition. So you have to have different levels of training to overcome those barriers. And not only have we been able to, and I've done this with many providers, getting high-level certifications with school. I'm not going to name any of them, but we've been able to get high-level certifications for post-secondary in IT and in hospitality, in retail. We've also been able to provide training through building our own schools, culinary schools. Helena Del Monte at ADE is a great example of that. And these appropriations are provided by the legislature if you have a plan, if you have a realistic vision that you can implement, and if you can show outcomes in your other programs. And so if there are any providers that are listening, there is such an enormous need and such an enormous increase in this population that your legislators, your state representatives, and your senators will welcome any provider who has a bona fide and effective plan to meet, you know, the needs of people with developmental disabilities that have barriers to employment, and to help them get funding for their communities. And there is funding available. I mean, we've been able to secure this year probably $5 million. And, you know, some of it is to actually build facilities, teaching facilities, like a culinary school with 5 teaching kitchens. So the money is there, and the legislature wants to do this. They want to find providers that are capable of meeting the needs of the constituents that they get so many requests for assistance from. Because honestly, we have a lot of services throughout the school, the K-12 portion of our loved ones' lives, but they're adults for a lot longer than their children, and we need to be able to provide these services. And so I would encourage you to talk to your local legislators and tell them, you know, put together a plan, put together a program, you know, target a specific population, you know, whether it's higher functioning or not as independent, but let them know that you're willing to train them, that you're willing to provide them the abilities to go out and learn. Because, you know, just taking someone and putting them into a program or putting them into a job without sufficient training, you know, and I'm talking about everything from you know, the real life needs that they need, the socialization, the financial literacy, everything that's involved, you know, the basic skills that they need to operate and to function, you know, in a job. And if you have all your bases covered and you can present, you know, a solid plan, and you have the employees that are dedicated to help these people, you know, the money is there.
Some serious infection. In a key study, the last to reduce infection. One of the things that, before we move on to group-supported employment, Paul Nolan made a comment regarding what happened with one of their group.
If you're allergic to it, or Neupogen, Filgrastim, an incomplete dose could increase infection risk.
Oh, okay. So Paul Nolan talked about a group home resident that that the group home resident wanted to work. And so what they've done is they've started a landscaping business, and the landscaping business is so successful that they are turning down work. But that's just an example of meeting an individual at their level and starting the process. And so for individuals who are in ADTs that want to work, one of the expectations is that they're learning new skills. And if they're interested in work, maybe those skills that they need to be learning are related to employment, some of these soft skills that you need to be successful in a job. So we have a little less than 30 minutes, so I'd like to move on to some of the questions we have for supported employment. One of the questions on the agenda is, why is there a low number of participants in group supported employment? And for example, there was 41 in fiscal year 2017-18. So what are the expectations for this service? Because we're not utilizing that service. And I saw comments before that talked about the staffing ratios for group supported employment, but what's the difference between ADT offsite and group supported employment? Why are there so few people accessing that service? Panelists?
This is Jan. From my former experience as a executive director of an agency that provided ADT and also provided supported employment. And one of the things that we noted was under group supported employment, there is the requirement to pay the competitive wage, and you don't have that in the ADT offsite. And so where we could not find contracts that would support everybody making minimum wage or above, often we rolled over to the offsite. Not that that's how it should be, but that's one reason you may see a difference in participation between the two, is you have to find an employer big enough that can afford to pay those competitive wages.
I would appreciate an explanation on what group supported employment really is.
Well, so as I understand it from the CMS definition, it's usually entailing a work enclave or a mobile crew. That is, as Jan mentioned, it is supposed to provide work-based skills training in those areas that are reimbursed at competitive wages. Now, as I understand it, a lot of what I'm hearing is that the ADTs who might be doing enclaves will be billing our services as an ADT service instead of a group supported employment service. So that's kind of why I think we're asking the question is, what is the expectation of this service? How is it different from ADT? And why is it so low? I would also like to mention, it wasn't the questions, but our ADT offsite rate is also, our participation, is very low. I believe we had less than 200 individuals who billed the waiver for last year for that service. So there's still a question as to why these particular service areas are so low, but yet when we go and talk with ADTs in the community, it seems like many of them are doing enclaves and mobile crew activities. So there's kind of a disconnect there, and we would like to know a little bit more as to why these services are being underutilized, at least from a billing statewide data collection standpoint.
And we have Ashley Crockett is asking, are job coaches required to have a 4-year degree? And that's something that I would have to look into the handbook for. But, and Ashley, you can probably get an answer to that question by looking at the staffing requirements in the handbook. But we can respond to your question after the call. And Teresa Flick says employers don't want groups of disabled individuals and businesses, especially in rural areas. And Kevin Lewis suggested that they provided contracted services and group supported employment settings for over a decade. So, and maybe some of the data that we're looking at is from that he's referring to. Abby Skipper is asking, are all of the participants in these ADTs and group support employment enclaves on the med waiver? And that's all we're able to capture. So there may be individuals who are not, who are self-pay, who are accessing services, but we're only able to capture the claims data for individuals on the waiver. And Rebecca's answering Ashley's question regarding the staff
Requirement.
the staff, the job, the education requirement. She's saying no, a degree is not required. And Debbie Terenzio is suggesting that the barrier to ADT offsite is a need for 1 to 3 staffing ratio. So
Just, can I pose a question to the group? Does anybody do ADT offsite with a non-work activity? Do you bill the waiver for community-based life skills kind of activities that are not having a work component? And the reason why I ask that is because I believe the handbook really narrows it specific to work.
and Ashley Crockett is saying that yes, they do that.
Okay.
I've had my coffee, yes. I've had my coffee.
Okay, Suzanne, now that you've had your coffee, maybe you could give us input regarding the group supported employment. Why the numbers of participants in that service, and welcome to the call. Why the numbers of people participating in group supported employment so low? Oh, she's muted. Suzanne, are you there? And Debbie's talking about the community integration activities that they do at UCP of South Florida, UC of South Florida. So we have a little more than 15 minutes left, so I'd like to talk about the questions that were asked regarding ADTs. So we'd like to know, how are individuals' interests, strengths, and barriers being considered in planning for meaningful day activities, especially those individuals who want to work? Oh, Rebecca is talking about the individuals in group, volunteering at food pantries and lunch programs and Meals on Wheels for offsite ADT.
This is Jean Malaco. In a personal reference, when my daughter was in the ADT, they did not do anything. She gave them ideas. She talked about different strategies. She talked about all the things we're talking about today. But the ADT she was in said, oh, those are great ideas. Wouldn't hire her, even part-time, but also didn't utilize any of the suggestions she came up with. So it became a place that she just went and listened to them yell and basically just do nothing. There was no meaningful planning of their day activities. They did whatever somebody could find for them to do, that they paid to go to, outside to be in the community, which became boring after a while. was just a lack of interest on the staff to actually encourage them to go to work. When we talked about going to the community college to get a certificate in daycare, they didn't know how to do it. They weren't interested in pushing her out to get her a job, and yet that was their goal, so the next person could come in. But the kids that are higher functioning just sat there dead time. They could have been watching TV or on their computer all day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really unfortunate. And hopefully the changes that we're talking about today are going to change that for that ADT that your daughter was a participant in and several others, because basically what we have to do is be part of changing the culture of what happens at ADTs and the discussion about employment and some of these great ideas where people are learning employable skills by volunteering at food pantries and lunch programs, Meals on Wheels. Those are kinds of things that you could do to get those soft skills, like how to interact with other people. Conducting mock job interviews is a suggestion from Paul Nolan. And so the idea that your daughter had great suggestions and they weren't listened to, maybe for other people who are experiencing similar things, that's something that they can talk to APD about. You know, if your loved one is in an ADT and are not engaged in meaningful day activities and have even as far as suggested things and nothing is happening, maybe that's an opportunity that you can use to talk to APD to try and move things in a better direction.
I'm sure they're well aware of it. I'm on a council and I hear this from a whole lot of people that have their loved ones at this program that they just complain and complain and complain, but nothing's ever done.
Right. And so one of the things that I want everybody on the call to be aware of is the purpose of us engaging you as stakeholders is we want to hear these things. And there are people on the call who have been singing the same song that you're singing right now, and people have heard it and maybe haven't listened or heard it and wanted to do something different. But we need to establish a new culture where when we say meaningful day activities, we're not talking about doing math worksheets and coloring pages, because that's not age appropriate for most people, especially those who you're talking about who have the capacity to do employment, you know. So when you're beating your head up against the wall, you have to have an outlet. And so let's have a discussion, because, you know, and one thing that I say probably too much and need to come up with a better saying is the train has left the station on us reforming our ADTs and transforming and redesigning the ADT so that individuals who want to work have real opportunities, unencumbered opportunities to access competitive integrated employment. So when we see that that's not happening, we need to say something about it, and people need to actually do something about it now, because we have to make these changes.
This is Sandy Pritchard. Can I just put
Sure.
a positive spin on this maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Sandy Pritchard and I'm with the ARC Washington Homes counties in the Panhandle. And I'm so sorry that your daughter was not able to gain the experience she needed. But I did want to give just a little bit of a positive about an ADT. Our adult day training, we have about 75 individuals. And we have a fiber contract, which they are getting the necessary skills that they need. They package fiber, they weigh fiber, they seal the bags. It's like an assembly line of some sort, and then they pack the boxes and then they go out the door. That's what they do about 5 days a week. Plus, they're also getting the social training that they need, the skills. Our community exploration, they also do the Meals on Wheels. They deliver Meals on Wheels, and they also replenish a food bank once a month, but what our instructors for our community exploration do is they try to find activities within the surrounding area that might be Dothan, Panama City, anything that can bring some education. They go to the library, they go to the fire station, they go to the police station. I mean, there's the courthouse. And I know there's only so many times you can do that, but they try to go out and find ways that they can go into the community and educate our clients. But with the ADT, with the packaging of the fiber, I really feel like with our contracts that we're able to give them the job skills they need if they need to go out. So I did want to give you, just encourage you to let you know that there are ADTs out there that do work with their clients, and it's not just about sitting in a room watching a movie or doing math papers every day. There are some of us out here that are really working very, very hard with our clients to make sure that they obtain the skills that they need to get into the community and work outside of the ADT.
And that's great news. And I've seen comments from Katrina. Katrina, can you unmute your line?
Do you want me to?
Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Someone asked about the qualifications earlier. Be sure to go to the iBudget manual, page 116, and it will give you the supported employment criterion or qualifications. And you don't need a degree, but there are some specific things that you will have to meet. You'll need a lot of experience in supported employment. So be sure to visit the iBudget manual. You can visit it go online and look on page 1-16, and look for life skills 2, and it will give you all of the criterion that you'll have to meet or qualifications as a job coach.
Thank you, Katrina.
You're welcome.
Good, glad you're on the call.
Yes, I've been muted, and I'm sorry for flooding you guys in that comment section.
No, but that was good because
great.
Ashley Crockett had a good question.
Okay,
And we have 7 minutes left on the call. And I want to thank everyone who is really right now flooding the comment box with a lot of good ideas and things that you use. Christine from the ARC Jacksonville, the things that you guys are doing, the weekly focus groups, the sign-up sheets for announced opportunities as it relates to employment. I saw something earlier regarding having different levels within the ADT from Lauren Trish for individuals who are able or who have a higher capacity. They are given opportunities that are consistent with their ability to learn. So that's great that you're taking that extra step that's consistent with best practice to meet those needs, even though you have different levels of people in your ADT. I think that's great. There was a comment about the changing cultures. It takes a while, and what we're talking about isn't something overnight. The home and community-based settings rule was implemented in 2014, and here we are in 2019. We're not quite there, and the culture, the necessity of the culture change has to take hold, and so this is part of it. The state who is going to ensure compliance with these rules, and the people all the way down to the individuals who are actually wanting to work and getting these new opportunities because we're changing the way that we're doing business. Everybody's input is important and necessary. So I really appreciate all the great things and the opportunities and things that are consistent with best practice that I see popping up on the board.
Can I make one last closing remark, please? Not to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I apologize. I sat on one of these task force in 1997. We called it a task force for the redesign. But one of the things that you mentioned was the lawn service, and and this is something that we've been focused on, and they're called mission-based enterprises, where you have a training area with an enterprise that helps fund the tuition for those trainings for those training programs, whether they're culinary or electronics recycling or whatever. But there's an enterprise attached. It's kind of like micro enterprises, but on steroids, where they actually generate revenue. And there are many, many successful ones. And I really would love to get the term mission-based enterprises somehow in our statute so that we can get more funding for these. But with all due respect, the rates for the ADT programs do not allow providers to, create successful programs like this. Some do because they work really hard to do outside fundraising, but I think one of the biggest things that should come from this discussion is and I wasn't on for the whole program, but examine the rates for the ADT providers because they are way too low. And it's hard to run a good program without funding. And when you're taking care of a bunch of other areas and programs and people in the community, it's hard to fundraise outside and on your own. So that's one thing. The rates are really, really significant and should be increased.
And Ms. Goldstein, those are great points. And like we said in the beginning, funding is one of those necessary things that have come up over and over in this discussion. And the funding of ADTs, we see that, every year, and on the 23rd of May, we had a graph that we showed to participants. Every year, the reimbursement of ADT services is increasing exponentially, and it will do the same thing this year. But what we're talking about today is how to get individuals in supported employment. And we see that not only has that service been flat, but in the latest data that we have, we see that the reimbursement of supported employment is going down. And what we're trying to do is create a culture where we see the reverse happening. We want to see more individuals working. We want to see more billing of supported employment and less ADT, especially for those individuals who want to work. So
I think we should give the providers sufficient funding to create mission-based enterprises so that they can provide not only the training but the experience in some associated business, so that once they get the experience, then they can go out into the world and get a job anywhere.
Right, and one of the things that we talked about on the 23rd is we looked at all 50 states, and those states who have the highest reimbursement rate, or they have some of the lowest outcomes as it relates to employment. And so not always is it going to be like that. And we do recognize that funding is an important thing that we need to, it's one of those elephants in the room that we have always mentioned in this discussion. But there was a provider on today's call that talked about taking one of his members from his group home, giving him a lawnmower, and now he's having to turn down business. And there are tons of people on here who are talking about different things, different opportunities that they've created that are working. And so I want to turn it over to David for the last minute to talk about where we are and what our next steps are.
So we've already scheduled our next meeting. Well, our goal is we'd like to have these discussions continue at least through September and on a monthly basis, and then reevaluate at the end of September. So what we're going to do is we've already scheduled our next meeting for next month. It's July 23rd, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So July 23rd, we're moving the time to 10 to 11:30 Eastern time. For those of you on the Central time, it would be what, 9 o'clock your time. And then we'll take the feedback from today's discussion and be able to use that as we're kind of like narrowing down the searches of areas that we can really hone in on what we want to improve upon in this redesign. We'll provide you with a summary of today's discussion. I believe we've got all recorded and we've got the comments. We're going to have a worksheet. We'll be able to make it a little prettier so people can see sort of a summary of the feedback from there. So anything else that I neglected? I want to echo Kalima. Thank you all for participating and typing in and trying to weigh in on a lot of these different topics. This is a very rich discussion. There's lots of areas to consider, but we're looking forward to continuing to work with you this year. So any last thoughts from the group here in the room?
Thanks
Okay.
again, and I look forward to our July 23rd conversation.